My daughter-in-law slept with my husband a week before we signed the divorce papers. I pretended I knew nothing. At the meeting, the lawyer handed me a document denying me my rights. I smiled. What I did next left everyone in shock. I'm so glad to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of my dining room as I set out my grandmother's china for lunch. Grace had called that morning, her voice unusually tense when she asked if we could talk, just the two of us. Something in her tone tied a knot in my stomach, but I pushed the feeling aside. Grace was the older sister of Amber, my daughter-in-law, and while we had always been cordial, we weren't particularly close. I smoothed my hands over the tablecloth, the same cream-colored linen I'd used for family gatherings for 30 years. At 64, I still took pride in keeping traditions, in creating a welcoming home. The house felt too quiet lately, with only me moving through it. Arthur, my husband of 42 years, had been distant for months, always finding excuses to work late or disappear into his study. And Daniel, our 35-year-old son, was so wrapped up in his marriage to Amber that his visits had become superficial. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Grace standing on my front steps, clutching her purse like a shield. She looked pale, her usually perfect makeup slightly smudged around her eyes, as if she'd been crying. "Eleanor, thank you for seeing me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course, my dear. Come in, come in." I led her to the dining room, noticing how her hands trembled slightly as she set down her bag. "I made your favorite chicken pot pie, and that lemon meringue pie you raved about at Easter." She managed a weak smile but didn't touch the food I had so carefully prepared. Instead, she stared at her intertwined hands, her knuckles white from the tension. "Grace, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." She met my gaze then, and I saw something in her brown eyes that chilled my blood. Hurt, guilt, and underneath it all, a desperate kind of love. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something, and I don't know how to say it without destroying everything." My heart began to pound, but I kept my voice steady. "Whatever it is, we can figure it out together." Grace took a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. "It's about Amber and Arthur." The world tilted slightly, but I forced myself to remain still. My hands folded calmly in my lap. "What about them?" "They're having an affair." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them in for so long they'd built up pressure. "I've known for weeks. I saw them together at that little cafe downtown, the one near Arthur's office. They were holding hands, kissing, acting like lovers. I felt something inside me crack, like ice breaking on a frozen pond, but my voice remained steady. "Are you sure?" Grace nodded miserably. I confronted Amber about it. She didn't even try to deny it. She just laughed and said it was none of my business. "But Eleanor, the things she said about you..." Her voice broke completely then. "What things?" I asked, though a part of me didn't want to know. "She said you were old and boring, that Arthur deserved better. She said once the divorce was final, she would make sure you got as little as possible. She's been planning this, Eleanor. All of it. She married Daniel to get close to the family, to the money. She's been working on Arthur for months." The room spun around me, but I gripped the edge of the table and held on. 42 years of marriage. A son I had raised with love and dedication. A daughter-in-law I had welcomed with open arms. All of it crumbling because of greed and betrayal. "Why are you telling me this?" I whispered. Grace reached across the table and took my hand. "Because it's wrong. Because you have been nothing but good to our family. And you don't deserve this. Because Daniel doesn't deserve to be married to someone capable of this level of deceit." She paused, wiping her eyes with her free hand. "And because I love my nephew and niece. And I can't stand by and watch Amber destroy everything good in this family." I looked at our joined hands, mine wrinkled and age-spotted, hers smooth and young. "Does Daniel know?" "No. And I don't know if I should tell him. It would destroy him." I rose slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the garden Arthur and I had planted together in our first years. The roses were in full bloom, their red petals brilliant against the green foliage. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful. But underneath, the roots were rotting. "What are you going to do?" Grace asked from behind me. I turned to her, and something had shifted inside me. The initial shock was giving way to something colder, more calculated. I had spent my entire adult life taking care of others, smoothing over problems, keeping the peace. But this was not something that could be smoothed over. "Nothing," I said calmly. Grace's eyes widened. "Nothing? I'm going to pretend I never heard this conversation. I'm going to smile and play the part of the devoted wife and mother, and I'm going to let them think they are winning. But Eleanor..." "Grace, my dear, some games require patience, and I have been patient for a very long time." I sat back down, pouring myself a cup of coffee with steady hands. "Tell me, does Amber know you're here?" "No, she thinks I'm at work." "Good. It needs to stay that way. Can you do that for me? Can you pretend you never told me this?" Grace nodded slowly. "But what about Daniel? What about their marriage?" I took a sip of coffee, letting the familiar ritual calm my racing thoughts. "Some battles aren't won by charging in with guns blazing, my dear. Sometimes you have to let your enemies believe they've already won." After Grace left, I sat alone in my dining room for a long time, staring at the untouched pie and pot pie. The house felt different now, as if the very walls had shifted. Every family photo on the mantel, every shared memory tied to the furniture and decor, all of it was tainted by the knowledge of what was happening under my own roof. When Arthur came home that night, I was in the kitchen preparing his favorite dinner, beef brisket with potatoes and carrots, the same meal I had made every Thursday for 40 years. "Smells good," he said, not meeting my eyes as he loosened his tie. "Long day at the office?" I asked pleasantly, as if I didn't know he'd likely spent his lunch hour with my daughter-in-law. "The usual." He disappeared upstairs to change, and I continued setting the table, my movements automatic and precise. When he returned, we ate in relative silence, the conversation limited to mundane topics about the weather and household repairs. But I watched him carefully now, noticing things I had overlooked before. The way he checked his phone constantly, the new cologne he had started wearing, the fact that he no longer looked at me when he spoke. 42 years, and I was only now seeing my husband clearly. That night, as I lay beside him in our marriage bed, I stared at the ceiling and made a decision. They wanted to play a game? Fine, but they had no idea who they were playing with. Living with the knowledge of betrayal was like walking on broken glass. Every smile I forced, every pleasant conversation I maintained, cut deeper into my soul. But I persisted, playing my part as the naive wife and mother, all while carefully observing the elaborate deceit unfolding in my own home. 3 days after Grace's revelation, Amber arrived for our usual Sunday dinner. She swept into my kitchen wearing a new designer dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile as bright and fake as costume jewelry. "Eleanor, you look wonderful," she gushed, embracing me with theatrical warmth. "I love what you've done with the flowers on the table." I returned her hug, noting the expensive perfume clinging to her skin, the same scent I had detected on Arthur's shirts lately. "Thank you, dear. Daniel should be here soon. Would you like some iced tea while we wait?" "That would be lovely." She settled herself at the kitchen island, crossing her legs elegantly. "Actually, I was hoping we could chat a bit, just us girls." My hands remained steady as I poured the tea, though my heart began to race. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Amber took a delicate sip and leaned forward conspiratorially. "I'm worried about you, Eleanor. About you and Arthur." The audacity of it almost took my breath away. Here she was, the architect of my marriage's destruction, pretending to be concerned. "Oh? Why would you be worried?" "Well, you two just seem so distant lately. At family gatherings, there's this tension." She placed her manicured hand over mine in a gesture of false sympathy. "Marriage can be so challenging after so many years. Sometimes the spark just fades." I nodded thoughtfully, as if I were considering her words. "You know, you might be right. We have been going through a difficult time." Amber's eyes lit up with a satisfaction she tried to disguise as concern. "Have you considered therapy? Or maybe it's time to think about what would make you both happiest in the long run. Do you think we should get a divorce?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "I'm not saying that," she backtracked quickly, but I could see the excitement under her worried facade. I just think life is too short to stay in an unfulfilling marriage. You deserve to be happy, Eleanor. You deserve someone who appreciates you. The irony was suffocating. That's very thoughtful of you to say. I care about this family, she continued, her voice taking on a practiced sincerity. Daniel would want both his parents to be happy, even if that means being apart. And honestly, you're still such an attractive woman. I'm sure there are plenty of men who would be thrilled to have someone like you. I smiled and nodded, playing the part of the naive older woman being gently guided toward divorce by her caring daughter-in-law. Inside, I was cataloging every word, every gesture, every calculated manipulation. When Daniel arrived, the dynamic shifted immediately. Amber transformed into the doting wife, hanging on his every word, constantly touching his arm, laughing at his jokes with exaggerated delight. But I noticed how her eyes kept darting toward the driveway, waiting for Arthur's car to pull in. Arthur walked into the dining room 20 minutes late, claiming he'd been held up at the office. Amber's cheeks flushed as he kissed my cheek in greeting, and I watched their eyes meet for a moment too long across the table. "Sorry I'm late," Arthur said, taking his usual seat. "Crisis with the Martinez account." "No problem," Daniel replied. "We were just talking about the vacation Amber and I are planning for next month." "Oh, that's right," Arthur said, his attention suddenly sharp. "Where are you thinking of going?" "We haven't decided yet," Amber said, her voice breathier than usual. "Maybe somewhere warm and tropical, a place where we can just escape from everything." The way she looked at Arthur when she said escape made my stomach turn, but I continued cutting my brisket with steady hands, my expression pleasant. "That sounds wonderful," I said. "You young people work so hard, you deserve a break." After dinner, while Daniel and I cleared the plates, Amber and Arthur remained at the table, their conversation low and intimate. I strained to catch snippets of their words. "We can't keep doing this," Amber's voice, urgent and pleading. "Not much longer now," Arthur's reply, reassuring. "Does she suspect anything?" Amber again, worried. "She doesn't know a thing," Arthur, dismissive. "They were wrong. I knew everything." But I continued loading the dishwasher, humming softly, as if I didn't have a care in the world. The following week, I made an appointment with my lawyer. Not the family lawyer Arthur and I had used for years, but a sharp woman named Catherine Ward, who specialized in complex divorce cases. Her office was in a part of Philadelphia far from our usual haunts, ensuring I wouldn't be seen by anyone who might report back to Arthur. Catherine was younger than me, probably in her 40s, with intelligent dark eyes and an air of competence that immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Morales," she said after I'd explained my situation, "I have to ask why you haven't confronted your husband directly about the affair." I clasped my hands in my lap, choosing my words carefully, because I want to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before I make any moves. This house, our assets, our family's legacy. I need to know where I stand legally. Catherine nodded in approval. "Smart approach. Let's start with the basics. How are your assets currently titled?" For the next hour, we went through everything. The house, purchased 40 years ago with money from my family's estate. The investment accounts, built up over decades of careful saving. The family business Arthur had inherited from his father. Most importantly, the trust that had been established by my grandfather, which included the house and several other properties. "This is interesting," Catherine said, studying the trust documents I had brought. "Your grandfather was very forward-thinking. This trust has some very specific provisions regarding inheritance and divorce." "What kind of provisions?" "Well, the house can never be sold or transferred to anyone outside of your direct bloodline. Even if you divorce, your husband would have no claim to it. And there's a clause in here about infidelity that's quite unusual for trusts established in that era." My pulse quickened. "What does it say?" Catherine read from the document. "In the event that a marriage is dissolved due to adultery, the innocent party shall retain all rights to the trust properties, and the offending party shall forfeit any and all claims to assets derived from or connected to said trust." I leaned back in my chair, feeling something like hope stir in my chest for the first time in weeks. "So, if I can prove Arthur's affair, you would retain not only the house, but several other properties and investments that are connected to the trust. Properties that your husband currently believes he has a claim to, and he doesn't know about these provisions? Catherine shook her head. From what you've told me, it sounds like he's operating under the assumption that you would be entitled to half of everything in a standard divorce proceeding. He has no idea about the trust protections. I left Catherine's office feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Arthur and Amber thought they were playing chess, but they didn't even know all the pieces on the board. That night, I watched as Arthur struggled to maintain his facade of the devoted husband. He praised my cooking with forced enthusiasm, asked about my day with manufactured interest, and kissed my forehead goodnight with lips that had been kissing another woman. But I could see the cracks in his performance. The guilt was eating at him, even as his arrogance convinced him he was getting away with it. "Arthur," I said, as we were getting ready for bed, "I've been thinking about what Amber said the other day, about our marriage." He went still, his back to me as he hung up his shirt. "What about it? Maybe she's right. Maybe we should consider our options." He turned then, and I saw a flash of something in his eyes. Relief? Excitement? "Are you saying you want a divorce?" I shrugged, as if the thought didn't break my heart. "I'm saying maybe it's time for both of us to find our happiness, wherever that may lead." Arthur nodded slowly, trying to look solemn while clearly fighting a smile. "If that's what you want, Eleanor, I just want you to be happy. Liar." But I smiled back at him, playing my part in this terrible theater. I want us both to be happy. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Arthur's satisfied breathing beside me, I thought of Amber's triumphant smile, of the expensive dress and perfume she now wore to family dinners, of the way she touched my son's shoulder while planning her escape with his father. They thought they were so clever. They thought they had already won. They had no idea the game was just beginning. The law offices of Sterling and Associates occupied the top floor of a gleaming skyscraper, all marble and mahogany designed to intimidate. I sat in the reception area, my hands folded calmly in my lap, while Arthur paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, checking his phone every few seconds. He'd been on edge all morning, snapping at me over breakfast and muttering under his breath about getting this over with. Amber had insisted on coming, claiming she wanted to support Daniel during this difficult time for the family. Now she sat next to my son, her hand resting possessively on his thigh as she whispered reassurances in his ear. Daniel looked devastated, his face pale and drawn. He still believed this divorce was a mutual decision, a sad but amicable end to a marriage that had simply run its course. If only he knew the truth. Mr. and Mrs. Morales, a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit, approached us. "I'm Richard Sterling. Thank you for coming in today." Arthur had chosen Sterling himself, claiming the man was the best divorce attorney in the city. What Arthur failed to mention was that Sterling was also a longtime friend of his from the golf club, a detail I had uncovered during my own background research. We were led into a conference room dominated by a massive table surrounded by leather chairs. Sterling took his seat at the head, spreading documents across the polished surface with practiced efficiency. Arthur sat to his right, while I took the chair directly opposite them. Daniel and Amber positioned themselves at the far end of the table, close enough to observe but removed from the main proceedings. "Before we begin," Sterling said, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone used to controlling rooms, "I want to ensure everyone understands that this is intended to be an amicable dissolution. Both parties have expressed a desire to handle this matter with dignity and fairness." I nodded gracefully. "Of course, that's what we both want." Arthur shot me a quick look, likely surprised by my cooperative tone. He had been expecting a fight, arguments, tears. Instead, I had been nothing but reasonable since agreeing to the divorce, which had clearly unsettled him. "Excellent," Sterling continued. "Now, let's review the proposed settlement." He slid a thick binder across the table toward me. "As you'll see, we've attempted to divide the marital assets equitably, taking into consideration the length of the marriage and both parties' contributions." I opened the binder and began to read, my expression neutral even as the words on the page made my blood boil. According to Sterling's proposal, I would receive the small downtown condo we'd bought as an investment 15 years ago, along with half of our joint savings account and a modest monthly alimony payment. Arthur would retain the family home, the business, the vacation properties, and the majority of our investment portfolio. This seems rather one-sided, I said softly, not looking up from the documents. Sterling cleared his throat. I understand your concern, Mrs. Morales, but we have to consider the reality of the situation. Your husband has been the primary earner throughout the marriage, and the business requires continuity of leadership. The house has significant upkeep costs that would be difficult for you to manage on a reduced income. Translation. They thought I was too old, too dependent, too naive to fight for what was rightfully mine. Furthermore, Sterling continued, his tone growing more condescending, there are some complications regarding the house specifically. It seems there may be some irregularities with the original deed and the trust documentation. Until those matters are sorted out, it would be prudent to leave the property in Mr. Morales's name to avoid any legal entanglements. I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it. They were trying to steal my family's home using fabricated legal complications. I could see Amber sitting up straighter in her chair, likely calculating how soon she could redecorate the master bedroom. I see, I said quietly. And these irregularities, when do you expect them to be resolved? Sterling waved his hand dismissively. These things can take years to sort out. Generational property transfers, trust modifications, it's quite complex. Really, it's better for everyone if we keep things simple. Eleanor. Arthur leaned forward, his voice taking on the patient tone he'd used to explain complex business deals to me for years. I know this isn't easy, but Sterling knows what he's talking about. This way, you won't have to worry about property taxes, maintenance, all those headaches. The condo will be perfect for you, much more manageable. Manageable, as if I were a child who needed to be protected from adult responsibilities. I looked around the table, taking in each face. Sterling, smug and satisfied with his clever manipulation of legal language. Arthur, trying to look sympathetic while barely containing his excitement at getting everything he wanted. Amber, her eyes shining with triumph as she pictured herself as the lady of my family's house. And Daniel, my sweet boy, looking uncomfortable but trusting that his parents were handling things fairly. Well, I said, closing the binder with a soft snap. I suppose you've thought of everything. Sterling smiled, likely thinking he'd won. We've tried to be thorough, yes. Of course, you're welcome to have your own attorney review the documents, but I believe you'll find everything is quite standard for a case like this. A case like this. A devoted wife of 42 years being cast aside so her husband could play house with their son's wife. That won't be necessary, I said, reaching for the pen Sterling offered. Where do I sign? The room went silent. Even Amber looked surprised by my immediate capitulation. Are you sure, Mom? Daniel asked, his voice uncertain. Maybe you should take some time to think about it. I turned to my son, this good man who still believed in fairness and honesty because I had raised him to, and I smiled. Sweetheart, sometimes in life you have to know when to fight and when to accept reality. Your father and I have had a good run, but it's time for us both to start new chapters. Arthur was frowning now, clearly baffled by my easy surrender. He had expected a battle. He had likely prepared arguments and justifications for why he deserved everything. My compliance was making him nervous. You sign here, Sterling said, pointing to a line at the bottom of the final page. And here, and initial here. I signed my name with steady strokes, each letter precisely formed. Eleanor Elizabeth Morales. The same signature I had used on our marriage certificate 42 years ago, back when I believed in forever. There, I said, putting down the pen and looking directly at Arthur. I hope this gives you everything you're looking for. Something flickered in his eyes. Then guilt, perhaps, or a belated recognition of what he was destroying. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the selfish satisfaction of a man who thought he'd gotten away with betraying his wife. Amber could barely contain herself. She reached over and squeezed Daniel's hand, her voice breathy with excitement. I'm so proud of how you're both handling this with such maturity. It takes real strength to put family first. Family first. The woman who was sleeping with her father-in-law was giving me a lecture on putting family first. Thank you, dear, I said warmly. That means a lot, coming from you. As we prepared to leave, Sterling gathered the signed documents with obvious satisfaction. "I'll file these with the court tomorrow. The divorce should be finalized in 60 days. 60 days until Arthur was free to marry his son's wife. 60 days until Amber thought she would be living in my family's home. 60 days until they discovered that some games have rules the players don't even know exist." Outside the building, Daniel hugged me tightly, his eyes moist with unshed tears. "Mom, are you okay? You seem so calm about all this." I patted his cheek, this boy who looked so much like his father at that age, back when Arthur still had a soul. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Everything is going to work out exactly as it's meant to." Amber appeared beside us, her arms sliding around Daniel's waist in practiced possession. "Your mom is incredibly strong, honey. She's going to be so much happier now." "I'm sure I will," I agreed, meeting her triumphant gaze with a serene smile. "I'm sure we all will be." As they walked away, I could hear Amber's excited chatter about helping me pack, about finding me a nice retirement community where I could make friends my own age, about how much simpler life would be for everyone now. I stood there in the shadow of the skyscraper, watching my husband and daughter-in-law celebrate their victory, and I felt a deep, cold satisfaction settle in my chest. They thought they had won. They thought they had outsmarted the naive, aging woman who had spent 42 years taking care of everyone else. They had no idea that in exactly 60 days, when their divorce was final and they tried to claim their prizes, they would discover that some properties don't belong to husbands or wives, but to bloodlines that stretch back for generations. I walked to my car with steady steps, already thinking about the phone call I needed to make to Catherine Ward. There were preparations to complete, documentation to gather, and a few more moves to make in this chess game they didn't even know they were losing. The real show was about to begin. 2 weeks after I signed the divorce papers, I was tending to my rose garden when I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. Daniel's car pulled in, but something was wrong. Instead of his usual cheerful greeting, he sat behind the wheel for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing holding him upright. When he finally emerged, I could see that my son was broken. His normally impeccable appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, his hair unkempt. But it was his eyes that broke my heart. They had the hollow, devastated look of someone whose world had just collapsed. "Daniel?" I put down my gardening shears and rushed toward him. "Sweetheart, what is it? What's wrong?" He looked at me for a moment, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't find the words. Then his face crumpled, and he collapsed onto my front steps like a puppet whose strings had been cut. "She's been lying to me," he whispered, his voice raw with pain. "This whole time, she's been lying, and—" I sat down next to him, not trusting myself to speak. Part of me wanted to pull him into my arms and tell him everything would be okay. Another part wanted to demand details, to finally have confirmation of what I had known for weeks. Instead, I waited, letting him find his way to the truth in his own time. "I found text messages," he continued, staring at his hands. "Hundreds of them. Between Amber and Dad. They've been planning this whole thing for months." My heart ached for him, but I forced my voice to remain calm. "Planning what exactly?" Daniel let out a bitter laugh that sounded nothing like my gentle son. "The divorce. The affair. They thought they were so clever, waiting until after you signed the papers to run off together. Amber was bragging to someone about how easy it was to manipulate both of you." The words hit me like physical blows, even though I'd known the truth for weeks. Hearing it from Daniel's lips made it real in a way all my observations and suspicions hadn't. "How did you find out?" I asked quietly. "Grace called me." Daniel's voice was thick with both gratitude and pain. "She said she couldn't watch it happen any longer. She told me where to look, what to look for." I thought she was crazy at first, but then I checked Amber's phone while she was in the shower, and he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I could imagine what those messages contained. The excitement, the planning, the cruel laughter at the expense of the people they were betraying. "Grace has been trying to warn people for weeks," Daniel went on. "She said she tried to talk to Amber, begged her to stop, but Amber just laughed, said she'd worked too hard to get this close to our family's money to give up now. Money. Of course, it all came back to money. Not love, not a genuine connection. Just a cold calculation of assets and inheritance. "Where is Amber now?" I asked. I confronted her this morning. I showed her the messages I found. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. She didn't even try to deny it. She just shrugged and said I was naive if I thought she'd ever really loved me. Said Dad could give her things I never could. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. To dismiss years of marriage, to mock the love of a good man who had done nothing but adore her, it was beyond comprehension. "I threw her out," Daniel said, his voice gaining strength. "I told her she had 1 hour to pack her things and get out of our house. She laughed at me, Mom, said it didn't matter, because she'd be living somewhere much nicer soon anyway. Somewhere much nicer. My family home, which she believed would soon be hers. I'm so sorry, sweetheart," I said, finally allowing myself to touch his shoulder. "You didn't deserve any of this." Daniel looked at me then, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "How are you so calm about this? Dad betrayed you too. He threw away 42 years of marriage for her." I studied my son's face. This man I had raised to believe in kindness and loyalty, and I made a decision. He deserved to know he wasn't alone in this, that someone else was fighting for what was right. "Daniel, there's something I need to tell you. About the divorce. About what really happened in that lawyer's office." For the next hour, I told him everything. About Grace's warning. About my weeks of careful observation. About Catherine Ward and the provisions in the family trust that Arthur and Amber knew nothing about. Daniel listened in stunned silence as I explained how I had deliberately played the part of the naive, defeated wife, all while gathering evidence and preparing my real response. "You knew," he whispered when I had finished. "This whole time, you knew what they were doing?" "I knew," I confirmed, "and I let them think they had won. Because sometimes the best strategy is to let your opponents reveal exactly who they are before you make your move." Daniel looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. "Mom, I had no idea you were so strategic." I smiled sadly. 42 years of marriage teaches you a lot about people, sweetheart, including when to fight and when to bide your time. "So what happens now? When Dad finds out about the trust?" "That's up to him and Amber." I stood up, brushing dirt from my gardening clothes. "They made their choices. Now they have to live with the consequences." Daniel stood up too, looking more like himself than he had since he arrived. "What about us? I mean, I know Amber is my wife or was my wife, but I can't just pretend this didn't happen." "You don't have to pretend anything," I assured him. "You are the innocent party in all of this. You have every right to protect yourself." As if summoned by our conversation, another car pulled into the driveway. This time it was Grace, her face anxious as she hurried toward us. "Daniel, I am so sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know this is all my fault. If I hadn't told you to look." "You saved me," Daniel interrupted, his voice firm. "If you hadn't warned me, I would have spent months, years, married to someone who was using me. You saved me from wasting my life on a lie." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I should have said something sooner. I should have protected you better." I watched the two of them, noticing how Grace's genuine anguish contrasted so starkly with Amber's calculated manipulations. Where Amber was all sharp edges and hidden agendas, Grace radiated warmth and sincerity. Even in her guilt and pain, she was thinking of Daniel's well-being. "Grace," I said gently, "you did exactly the right thing. You chose loyalty and honesty over family convenience. That takes real courage." She looked at me with surprised gratitude. "I was so afraid you would hate me for bringing this into your family." "My dear, you didn't bring anything into our family. You revealed what was already here, festering in the dark. Now we can deal with it in the light." Daniel moved closer to Grace, his hand hovering near her shoulder as if he wanted to comfort her, but wasn't sure if it was appropriate. "Grace, I need you to know how grateful I am, not just for warning me, but for being honest when it would have been easier to stay quiet." The look that passed between them was charged with something new and tentative. Not romance, not yet, but a recognition of shared values, of similar wounds, of the possibility that something good could grow from the ashes of this betrayal. "I should go," Grace said suddenly, as if realizing she was intruding on a family crisis. You two need time to process all this. Actually, Daniel said quickly, would you want to stay for dinner? Mom makes the best brisket in the state, and I think we could all use a normal conversation right now. Grace looked to me for permission, and I nodded warmly. I'd love for you to stay. It's been too long since we've had an honest conversation around our table. As the three of us walked into the house, I felt something shift in the air around us. The toxic cloud that had been hovering over our family was finally starting to lift. Amber's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also revealed the true character of everyone involved. Daniel was stronger than I had given him credit for, capable of facing hard truths and making difficult decisions. Grace was proving to be everything her sister was not: loyal, honest, selfless. And I had rediscovered my own strength, my ability to plan and wait and fight for what mattered. That evening, as we sat around my kitchen table sharing stories and laughter, I watched Daniel and Grace together. There was something healing in their connection, a recognition that they had both been betrayed by someone they loved, but that the betrayal didn't have to define them. You know, Grace said quietly as we cleared the dishes, Amber always said I was too soft, too trusting, said that nice guys finish last. Daniel paused in his work, looking at her intently. I used to think that being decent was enough, that if you treated people right and trusted them, they'd do the same for you. And now? I asked, curious how this experience would change my son. Daniel looked at Grace, then back to me. Now I think that being decent is still the right choice. But that doesn't mean you have to be naive. You can be kind and still protect yourself. You can trust people who prove they deserve it. As the evening wound down and Grace prepared to leave, Daniel walked her to her car. Through the kitchen window, I watched them standing and talking quietly in the driveway, their conversation intimate and serious. When he finally came back into the house, there was something different in his expression. She's remarkable, he said simply. Yes, she is, I agreed. So different from her sister. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. I keep thinking about what you said earlier, about letting people reveal who they really are. Amber showed me exactly who she was, but I was too blind to see it. But Grace. She's been showing me who she is, too, and I almost missed it because I was so focused on the wrong person. Hearts heal, Daniel, and when they do, they often see more clearly than before. That night, as I got ready for bed in the house that would soon legally be mine again, I thought about the strange turns life takes. Amber's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also created opportunities for truth, for genuine connection, for new beginnings based on honesty instead of deceit. In trying to destroy our family, Amber had actually revealed its strength. She had stripped away the pretense and false loyalties, leaving only what was real and worth preserving. Tomorrow, I would call Catherine Ward and begin the final phase of my plan. But tonight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 63 days after I signed those divorce papers in Sterling's office. I was sipping coffee on my back patio, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, when my phone rang. Arthur's name flashed on the screen, and for the first time in months, I felt a genuine amusement as I answered. Hello, Arthur. Good morning. What the hell have you done? His voice was raw with panic and rage, all pretense of civility gone. I took a leisurely sip of coffee before replying. Good morning to you too. I'm fine, thank you for asking. The weather is lovely today. Don't play games with me, Eleanor. My lawyer called me an hour ago. He says there's a problem with the house, some nonsense about a trust no one ever mentioned before. Oh, that. I kept my voice light, conversational. Yes, I imagine that came as quite a surprise. The silence on the other end stretched long enough to make me wonder if he'd hung up. Then his voice came back, lower and more dangerous than before. You knew. You knew about this trust the whole time, didn't you? Of course I knew. It's my family's trust, Arthur. My grandfather established it to protect our property from exactly this type of situation. This type of situation? His voice cracked with indignation. We're getting a divorce. That's normal, Eleanor. People get divorced every day. I stood up and walked to the edge of the patio, looking out at the garden my grandmother had planted, that my mother had tended, that I had lovingly maintained for 40 years. You're right. People do get divorced every day. but they don't usually commit adultery with their daughter-in-law while plotting to steal their wife's family home. His sharp intake of breath told me he hadn't expected such a direct confrontation. For weeks, I had played the part of the confused, hurt wife. Now, he was hearing from the woman who had been planning his downfall while he was celebrating his cleverness. "How long have you known?" he finally asked. "Long enough," I replied. "Long enough to document everything. Long enough to protect what matters. Long enough to watch you and Amber plan your little future together in my family's home." "Our house," he corrected automatically, but there was no conviction in his voice anymore. "No, Arthur. Never our house. The deed has always been in trust. You were allowed to live here as my husband, but you never owned a single brick. And now that you've chosen to end our marriage through adultery, you've forfeited any right to remain here." Another long silence. Then, in a voice that sounded like a man watching his world collapse, "Where am I supposed to go?" The pathetic quality of the question almost made me feel sorry for him. "Almost. I imagine you and Amber will figure it out. You're both so clever, after all. Eleanor, please, can't we work something out? I know I made mistakes, but—" "Mistakes?" I cut him off, my voice sharp for the first time. "Mistakes are forgetting to buy milk or missing an anniversary. What you did was a deliberate betrayal of everything we built together. What you did was seduce our son's wife and plot to steal my inheritance. Those aren't mistakes, Arthur. That's who you chose to become." I heard a woman's voice in the background, shrill and demanding. Amber, no doubt wanting to know what was happening to her carefully laid plans. "I have to go," Arthur said, his voice defeated. "But this isn't over." "Yes, it is," I replied calmly. "It's been over for quite some time. You just hadn't realized it yet." After I hung up, I sat back down and finished my coffee in peaceful silence. The phone rang several more times, Arthur's number, then an unknown number that was likely Amber, but I didn't answer. I had nothing more to say to either of them. An hour later, Daniel's car pulled into the driveway. He looked serious but determined as he walked up the patio steps, Grace by his side, holding a manila folder. "Mom, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Of course. Sit down." Daniel took the chair opposite me, while Grace settled next to him, their proximity speaking to the growing bond between them. For the past few weeks, they had become inseparable, finding comfort and understanding in their shared experience of betrayal. "Grace has been helping me go through Amber's things," Daniel began. "We found some documents I think you need to see." Grace opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers. These were hidden in a safe in Amber's closet. I think they show just how long this has been planned. The first document was a copy of my grandfather's will, annotated in Amber's handwriting with notes about property values and inheritance laws. The second was a timeline, meticulously detailed, showing when she had planned to seduce Arthur, when they would initiate the divorce proceedings, and when they expected to take possession of the house. But it was the third document that made my blood run cold. It was a life insurance policy on me, taken out by Amber 6 months ago, listing herself as the beneficiary. "She forged your signature," Grace said quietly. "I checked with the insurance company. They have no record of you ever agreeing to this policy." Daniel's face was pale with fury. "She wasn't just planning to steal from you, Mom. She was planning—" He couldn't finish the sentence. I stared at the policy, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The woman I had welcomed into my family, whom I had treated like a daughter, had been planning not only my financial ruin, but potentially something much worse. "There's more," Grace continued, pulling out a printed email. "This is from a private investigator Amber hired to look into your family's assets. She's been digging into the trust for months, trying to find loopholes. The investigator's report was thorough and chilling. It detailed not only the provisions of the trust, but my daily routines, my medical history, my relationships with neighbors and friends. Amber had been studying me like a predator studies its prey. "Daniel, I need you to take these documents to the police," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. "The forged insurance policy alone is a felony." "Already done," he replied. "I called Detective Martinez this morning. He's opening an investigation for identity theft and insurance fraud." We sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the full scope of Amber's treachery. She hadn't just been unfaithful. She had been systematically plotting to destroy our entire family. "There's something else," Grace said hesitantly. "Something I probably should have said weeks ago." Daniel took her hand encouragingly. "Go on. Amber isn't just manipulative and greedy. She's dangerous. This isn't the first time she's done something like this." Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "Our Aunt Helen died 2 years ago. Sudden heart attack. Very unexpected. Amber was taking care of her at the time, helping with her medications. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud." Daniel's grip on Grace's hand tightened. "The doctors said it could happen to anyone," Grace continued. "Helen had a heart condition, and sometimes these things just happen. But afterward, Amber inherited Helen's house and her savings, and she just seemed so pleased about it. Not grieving like you'd expect, but satisfied." "Did you tell the police this?" I asked. Grace nodded. "Detective Martinez is looking into Helen's death, too. He said they might exhume the body if they find enough evidence to warrant an investigation." We were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling aggressively into the driveway. Through the trees, I could see Arthur's Mercedes, followed by a small moving truck. Amber emerged from the passenger seat like a fury, her perfect facade finally cracking to reveal the calculating predator beneath. "That's my cue to go inside," I said, getting to my feet. "Daniel, would you and Grace mind handling this? I don't think I can look at either of them right now without saying something I might regret." From my living room window, I watched the confrontation unfold on my front lawn. Amber was screaming at Daniel, her face twisted in rage as she pointed at the house. Arthur stood by the moving truck, his shoulders slumped in defeat. 2 burly movers waited uncertainly, unsure whether to unload their cargo. Daniel's voice carried through the glass, calm but unyielding. "You're not welcome here, Amber. Neither of you are." "This is my house," Amber shrieked. "We signed papers. It's ours." "No," Grace said, stepping forward to stand beside Daniel. "It was never yours, and it never will be." The look Amber gave her sister was pure venom. "You did this. You poisoned them against me. You're just jealous because I found a way out of our pathetic family, and you're still a nobody." "I'd rather be a nobody than be you," Grace replied quietly. Amber lunged forward as if to attack her sister, but Daniel stepped between them, his presence enough to halt her advance. For a moment, the 3 of them formed a tableau. Daniel and Grace united in their strength and integrity, Amber isolated in her rage and desperation. "Get off my property," Daniel said, his voice carrying an authority I had never heard from him before. "Both of you. You have 5 minutes to get in that truck and leave, or I'm calling the police." Arthur finally spoke, his voice tired and broken. "Let's go, Amber. It's over." But Amber wasn't ready to accept defeat. She spun toward the house, her eyes wild as she caught sight of me in the window. "This isn't over," she screamed. "You think you're so smart, but I know things about this family. I know secrets that could destroy all of you." I opened the window slightly, my voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "The only secrets being destroyed today are yours, my dear. Detective Martinez is very interested in your relationship with your Aunt Helen." The color drained from Amber's face so quickly I thought she might faint. Arthur grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the truck with sudden urgency. "We're going," he yelled. "We're going right now." As the moving truck sped away, followed by Arthur's Mercedes, I felt something release in my chest. The strangers who had invaded my home, who had plotted to steal my legacy, and possibly worse, were finally gone. Daniel and Grace came inside, both looking emotionally drained but victorious. "It's over," Daniel said, collapsing into my favorite armchair. "They're really gone. The part about the house is over," I corrected gently. "But Amber still needs to face the consequences for what she did. The forgery, the fraud, possibly Helen's death. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they do turn." Grace curled up on the sofa, looking younger and more vulnerable than her 30 years. "I keep thinking I should feel sorry for her. She's my sister, after all, but I just can't. She chose this path," I assured her. "Step by step, decision by decision. You don't owe her your pity." As evening fell, the 3 of us made dinner together in my kitchen. It felt like a celebration, though none of us said it explicitly. We were celebrating survival, integrity, and the bonds that truly matter. Watching Daniel and Grace work side by side, I could see something beautiful growing between them. Not the desperate, grasping love that Amber had offered, but something real and lasting, built on mutual respect and shared values. "You know," I said, as we sat down to eat, "this house has seen a lot of history. My grandmother raised 5 children here. My mother survived the Great Depression within these walls. I raised Daniel here. And someday, I hope his children will play in that same backyard." Daniel and Grace exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their future together. "But tonight," I continued, raising my glass of wine, "we celebrate the fact that this house will remain in the hands of people who understand what family really means." As we toasted to new beginnings, I felt the deep satisfaction of a battle well fought and won. Amber and Arthur had tried to destroy everything I held dear, but in the end, they had only succeeded in revealing what was truly precious. 6 months later, I was in my kitchen, preparing for Thanksgiving dinner. The same kitchen where I had entertained Amber's false sympathy and endured her calculated manipulations. But today, the space felt entirely different, warm, honest, filled with genuine laughter and love. Daniel stood at the stove, carefully basting the turkey with the same concentration he'd shown as a boy learning to tie his shoes. Grace sat at the kitchen island, her engagement ring catching the afternoon light as she chopped vegetables for the stuffing. They had announced their engagement a month ago, and seeing them together still filled me with a quiet joy. "Mom, the timer for the sweet potatoes is going off," Daniel called, his sleeves rolled up, an apron protecting his shirt. "I'm on it," Grace said, sliding off her stool with practiced ease. Over the past few months, she had become an integral part of our home's rhythm, helping with the cooking, the garden, and the 1,000 small tasks that make a house a home. The doorbell rang, and I went to answer it, expecting our neighbors, the Gonzaleses, whom I'd invited to join us for dinner. Instead, I found Detective Martinez standing on my porch, his expression serious but not grim. "Mrs. Morales, I hope I'm not interrupting your celebration." "Not at all, Detective. Please, come in. Can I offer you some coffee? We have plenty of food if you'd care to stay for dinner." He followed me into the living room, declining my offer of refreshments. "I wanted to update you on the investigation before the holiday weekend." Daniel and Grace appeared in the doorway, their faces tense with anticipation. "Amber Herrera has been formally charged with insurance fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud," Martinez began. "The district attorney feels confident about securing convictions on all counts." "And Helen?" Grace asked quietly. Martinez's expression grew more somber. "The exhumation revealed traces of digitalis in your aunt's system, levels that would be consistent with intentional poisoning, not an accidental overdose of her heart medication." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "She really killed her? We are building a case for first-degree murder." Amber's fingerprints were found on the medicine bottles, and we discovered she had been researching the effects of digitalis online for weeks prior to Helen's death. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "What about Arthur?" "There's no evidence of his involvement in Helen's death, but he has been charged as an accomplice in the fraud schemes. His cooperation with the investigation will likely result in a reduced sentence." After Martinez left, we sat in the living room, absorbing the news. Justice was finally being served, but it felt hollow in a way. Helen was still gone, Daniel's marriage was still destroyed, and 42 years of my life had still been built on a foundation that crumbled the moment my husband chose betrayal over loyalty. "Are you okay, Mom?" Daniel asked, noticing my silence. I considered the question carefully. "I'm relieved," I said finally. "Relieved that Amber can't hurt anyone else. Relieved that Helen will get justice. But mostly, I'm relieved that we survived this with our integrity intact." Grace reached over and squeezed my hand. "I keep thinking about all the what-ifs. What if I hadn't told you about the affair? What if you hadn't known about the trust? What if Amber had succeeded? But she didn't," Daniel pointed out, "and we are all stronger now because of it." He was right. The past 6 months had tested us in ways I never imagined. But we had emerged more connected, more honest with each other, more aware of what truly mattered. The Gonzaleses arrived shortly after, followed by Catherine Ward and her husband, whom I'd invited after discovering we shared a love for gardening. The dining room filled with conversation and laughter, the kind of genuine warmth that cannot be manufactured or manipulated. As we sat down to dinner, I looked around the table at the faces gathered there. Real friends, chosen family, people who cared for each other without agenda or calculation. This was what Amber had never understood, that true wealth isn't measured in property values or bank accounts, but in the quality of the relationships you build. "Before we eat," I said, standing and raising my glass of wine, "I want to say something." The conversation quieted, all eyes turning to me. This year has been one of the most difficult of my life. I lost a marriage I thought would last forever. I discovered someone I loved was capable of unimaginable betrayal. I learned that my family was under attack from within. I paused, meeting each pair of eyes around the table. But I also learned that I am stronger than I ever imagined. I learned that my son is a man of integrity, who chooses love over revenge. I learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as losses. I looked directly at Grace, this woman who had had the courage to speak the truth when silence would have been easier. I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about people who have your back when the world tries to knock you down. People who choose honesty over convenience, loyalty over self-interest. Daniel stood and raised his own glass. To Mom, who taught us that grace under pressure isn't just a saying, it's a way of life. To Eleanor, Catherine added, who proved that patience and planning can overcome any adversary. To new beginnings, Grace said softly. And to the families we choose, as much as the families we are born into. As we clinked glasses, I felt a deep sense of completion. Not because the story was over. Daniel and Grace would be married in the spring. There would be grandchildren eventually. Life would go on with all its joys and challenges, but because I finally understood who I was, separate from being Arthur's wife or Daniel's mother. I was Eleanor Morales, guardian of my family's legacy, protector of what mattered, survivor of betrayal, and architect of my own future. After dinner, as our guests were preparing to leave, Catherine pulled me aside. "Have you thought about what you're going to do with the downtown condo?" she asked. "The one from the divorce settlement?" I smiled. "I'm thinking of turning it into a shelter for women who are rebuilding their lives after divorce. Nothing big or institutional, just a quiet place where someone can stay while they figure out their next chapter." Catherine nodded in approval. "Amber probably thought she was taking something valuable from you with that settlement. She had no idea she was giving you away to help other women in similar situations." Ironic, isn't it? Her greed became the foundation for something genuinely useful. Later that night, after Daniel and Grace had gone home to their apartment, I walked through the quiet house, turning off lights and checking locks, the same ritual I had performed for 40 years. But it felt different now. Peaceful instead of routine. Secure instead of automatic. In my bedroom, I opened the jewelry box where I kept my most precious possessions. I ran my fingers over the pearl necklace my mother had given me, over my grandmother's gold bracelet. I found what I was looking for, my original wedding ring. The simple gold band Arthur had placed on my finger when we were both young and full of dreams. I held it up to the lamplight, studying the inscription inside. Forever and beyond. Forever had lasted 42 years. Beyond had ended the day he chose another woman over his family. But that didn't erase the good years, the love that had been real, even if it hadn't been permanent. I placed the ring back in the box, not with anger or sadness, but with acceptance. That chapter of my life was closed, but the story went on. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Thanks for an amazing Thanksgiving, Mom. Grace and I are so grateful to have you in our lives." I typed back, "Thank you for becoming the man I always knew you could be. Sleep well." A second message appeared, this one from Grace. "I never had a mother who believed in me the way you do. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like." I wiped away the tears that sprang to my eyes. At 64, I was discovering that some of life's greatest gifts arrive in the second act, when you finally understand what you're worth and refuse to settle for anything less. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs, the sounds of a structure that had weathered many storms and would weather many more. I thought of my grandmother, who had raised 5 children in this house during the Great Depression. I thought of my mother, who had kept it as a sanctuary during World War II when my father was overseas. I was part of a long line of strong women who had protected what mattered, who had faced adversity with grace and determination. Amber had tried to break that chain, but she had only succeeded in forging it stronger. Tomorrow, I would start planning the shelter for divorced women, using the condo that was supposed to be my consolation prize. Next month, I would help Daniel and Grace plan their wedding, which would take place in the garden where my grandmother had married my grandfather 80 years ago. But tonight, I would simply be grateful for survival, for discovery, for the knowledge that at any age, at any stage of life, it is never too late to find out who you really are when all that is false is stripped away. Outside my window, the November wind whispered through the bare branches of the oak tree Arthur and I had planted on our 10th anniversary. It had weathered storms, droughts, and countless seasons of change. Like me, it had bent but not broken. It had endured. It had grown stronger. In the spring, it would bloom again. And so would I. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are favorites and that will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here. I'll see you in the next video.